Welcome to today's or this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. I'm actually in Seattle this week for the past Data Community Summit 2022, where for the past couple of years, we have been doing virtual conferences. And, it's really interesting coming here because, for one, the last time we had the past Data Community Summit here in Seattle was 2019. And now it's 3 years in. And it just feels weird because it's different. You can see people on a live stream like this. You can watch them, but there's no substitute to having that face-to-face interaction with people. And it's 7 o'clock in the morning in Seattle. This is actually outside of the speaker lounge, and like I said, it feels weird just being here and getting to experience this again. The last time I was here was 2019, and then when COVID hit, 2020 had to be either canceled or switched to a virtual event. The good thing about it is they decided to switch it to a virtual event. You've got a couple of people on the conference center today. I'm actually doing a session later today about burnout. My commitment with the past Data Community Summit is to not talk about SQL Server whenever I'm here, is to focus more on professional development, career development, soft skills, as what most people call them, or anything that has something to do with developing yourself in order for you to move ahead in your career. Not necessarily technical topics, although I volunteered to moderate a couple of sessions, one of which was moving to or deploying a SQL Server distributed availability group. So that was fun. The other session was also using distributed availability group to move to the cloud. And the interesting conversations that you hear from people and the questions that they ask are something that, for me, is a learning experience as well. The one thing I like about doing consulting work is the fact that I get the opportunity to work with different customers, different environments, different opportunities. And hey, Josh, yes, I didn't actually realize that Live 360 and the past Data Community Summit are happening both at the same time. I asked a few of the Microsoft folks because typically the Florida folks will be there, and then some of the folks from the West Coast will be here. But I didn't realize that both the Live 360 event, which is in Orlando, and the past Data Community Summit is happening on the same week. So hopefully next year. But some of the learnings that I've had throughout this week was, for one, there's always risks. And when people are going back into what was considered normal in the past, like, for instance, going back to face-to-face events like this, in-person events, there's a little bit of a risk that you have to keep in mind because, again, for the past 2 years, everything was virtual, people were working from home. And also people coming from overseas where the rules in the United States are different from the rules back home. Like for us in Canada, we have lifted a few of the restrictions. But again, that's one. The transition from virtual events, from virtual group dynamics like this to an in-person one changes everything. And the fact still remains, even though we all work in tech, we're humans. We are people. We need human connection. We thrive off of that. And community is a huge thing. So first day I volunteered, that was Tuesday, I volunteered to do a moderation. I was the moderator for an entire day's workshop for a pre-con that Redgate hosted on the whole DevOps thing. And interesting to hear people's stories and their journeys throughout the whole DevOps process, their adoption of DevOps. Part of that is also culture. And one of the reasons I also focus more on the culture and the process and the people aspect on the topics that I talk about here is because these are the things that people would encounter more of. Meaning the tools are there, the technology is there, but when the company does not have the culture to finally embrace the change, I mean, we're talking about people who have been doing things over and over and over again, and their way of thinking is that this is how we've done it in the past, and they're not willing to change anything, that's kind of like a red flag, because what we are trying to accomplish is to achieve goals. And if we're stuck with our old ways of thinking and our old ways of doing things, that is possibly hindering us from moving forward and achieving our goals. So that's the first day I did that. And then buddy networking hour for the first timers. I wrote, I don't know, 30+ page document, a guide for first timer. I started doing that back in 2016. And it's one of those things where I wish somebody wrote that document for me, where it's a guide for people coming into the PASS Summit, attending the PASS Summit for the very first time, and not just attending for the very first time. I'm pulling my beanie because it's actually cold outside. It's one of those things where I'm flying into the United States, coming from overseas, whether from Europe, from Asia Pacific, or wherever. What are we expecting? What do we expect, right? And those are the kind of experiences. And I've had opportunity to talk to so many first timers. In fact, we have a huge amount of people who are here for their first time. And the typical question I ask is, how's your first time experience? And in the guide that I wrote, I tell the story of how this is actually more than just a conference. It's kind of like a family reunion. Like, you know how it is? Well, let's talk about family members that you actually like to see, right? When you're coming in, it's like a family reunion. You get to see people that you've met along the way, people that I've met for the very first time back in 2007 when I attended my very first PASS Summit. And you create those relationships over time. Those could be professional relationships, those could be friendships, those could be anything. And they all started here. I remember 2007, my very first PASS Summit, I had the opportunity to meet the founders of MS SQL Tips, who gave me the opportunity to become a part of their team and write articles for them. I've had the opportunity to meet some of the greatest people on the planet, people working for Microsoft, part of the Microsoft Data Platform teams, the different product groups. I've had the opportunity to meet people who I've had the opportunity to share lunch, share dinner with, share breakfast with, do a 5K run with. These are opportunities for you to connect. And I was just talking to the first timer yesterday, where I was asking, so what have you learned so far? And most of the time, again, as a geek, as somebody who's a nerd, we mostly focus on the technical aspect of learning. You're attending a session, you're writing down all of the things that you want to learn. You got your learning goals when you come here, because of course, if somebody's paying for your trip, somebody's paying for your registration to the conference, you want to make sure that you're meeting those goals. But in addition to that is the conversations in the hallway, the conversations outside of the conference rooms. And what I typically refer to as, when you go to school, when you go to university, the real learning or the magic actually happens outside of the rooms. That's not to say not to attend the sessions, because I do attend the sessions myself, but it's also an opportunity for you to learn more from the people who are your peers, people who are considered to be working in the same industry, having the same challenges you have, having the same job title as you. Because sometimes it feels like you're alone, you're in your cubicle, or for the past 2 years, you're at home, you're in front of a computer, you're talking to your teammates, and you feel like you're all alone. When you come to a place like this, it feels like you're at home, because there are people around you who are having the same challenges, encountering the same issues, have the same problems, yet they found a solution to the problem that you're facing. So you don't have to do everything on your own. In fact, one of the things that I take advantage of is really just hanging out with the Microsoft engineers, the product team, because just being around them, hearing their conversations, learning from them, collapses all the months and even years of me trying to figure things out on my own. So might as well just learn from them, right? So talking about some of the sessions that I've attended a session on the DevOps journey, how you can bring the data into the DevOps. And again, hearing from the people who are asking questions as well as the people from the panel. And of course, everybody's already telling you about this on social media. SQL Server 2022 is generally available. Of course, there's a difference between GA and RTM, but typically GA and RTM is almost the same, unless of course Microsoft decides to make any changes. So make sure that you download a copy of SQL Server 2022, play around with it. What I have on my laptop is RC. I forgot what version of RC that I had a couple of months before. So take advantage of that, download it, play around with it. The other thing that I've had the opportunity to do is connect with the people that I've known for years. Some of the Microsoft vendors or third-party vendors, some of the Microsoft MVPs that I've met throughout the years. I mean, this is also one of the opportunities. You get to meet so many amazing people, right? People who would become your friends for years, people who would become your boss in the future, right? People who would become, business partners. You'll never know. But this is an opportunity where you can learn so much in a span of a week. And this is one of those things where instead of trying to do everything on your own, just like what I emphasize whenever I'm talking about or I speak about high availability and disaster recovery, where it's never an individual sport. HANDR is never an individual sport. It is a team sport. And so even with your own growth, it doesn't have to be an individual sport. Even professional athletes, they would have coaches. They would have people helping them so that they can raise their game. They can improve the way they perform. But same thing with your career, with your growth. You don't have to do it alone, right? Reach out to people, ask for their help. A lot of them are, especially in the Microsoft Data Platform community, a lot of them are very generous. They're more than willing to help you in any way, shape, or form. Even a simple introduction to somebody. And I've tried my best this week to make introductions to people, especially those who are first-time attendees, and just hearing their stories and making the connection. Because again, you'll never know what would come out of that. I've seen people who, at one point, I've seen in some of the events, grow, right, advance their career to now working for either Microsoft or AWS or some of the big cloud providers. Because part of that is also the commitment to grow, right? Attending a conference is one thing, attending an event is one thing, but there's this misconception that information alone is enough. In fact, that's part of my talk today. It's if you follow some of the things that I've done in the past, you know for a fact that I'm not huge on just taking in information. There's this myth of I want to learn more, and that is learning. Taking in as much information as you possibly can is learning. But the real acid test of that is when you take what you've learned and do something with it. You don't need to learn 25 different things or 25 new things. You only need to learn 3 things and then do something with those 3 things. It's surprising to see how, even in the conversations with distributed availability groups, and because I was the moderator, I was answering some of the questions online. But when you start to think about it, the technology that is always on availability groups, distributed availability groups, or all of these things that are part of the Microsoft SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery features, they're actually features from way back when. I talk about availability groups and how I almost got into trouble with the folks from Microsoft marketing when I started telling people this is not a new thing, right? SQL Server 7 introduced the concept of failover clustered instances. So you have Windows Server failover clustering. And then SQL Server 2005 introduced the concept of database mirroring. So all you're doing is combining the concepts. Now, I'm not talking about the technology underneath that because they've definitely improved it. But if you understand the concept of how something works, that's basically it. It's a new implementation of a concept that's been going on for decades, right? I was at a vendor presentation where they were talking about DevOps and Kubernetes, and you've probably seen that I wrote a book 2 years ago on SQL Server on Docker containers. But one of the things that people would always ask is, so how does Kubernetes work? How does this and how does that? Excuse me. The reality is nothing has changed as far as the underlying concepts are concerned. What do I mean by that? I've talked about how the basic foundations and the basic concepts remain. Whether it's Kubernetes, whether it's the cloud, or it's the mainframe. From generations ago, I don't know if you guys still remember the days of mainframe, there's the compute, right? The big mainframe in the back end. There's networking, where you have your dumb terminals connecting to your mainframes. And there's the storage, where you store your data. Compute, networking, storage. Whether you're working with a client-server environment, whether you're working with on-premises private cloud or physical servers, or you're talking about cloud or public cloud, or in the days of the DevOps where you're talking about Kubernetes, the same concepts remain. Compute, networking, and storage. The implementation of those concepts evolved throughout the years, but it's basically the same thing. When I was writing my SQL Server on Docker containers book, like deploying SQL Server on Dockers or Docker containers, I emphasized the fact that we've been doing this for years. Where in the good old days of SQL Server 7 or SQL Server 2000, when we were building failover clustered instances, your databases are on a storage subsystem, which is your storage area network. They're being accessed through a connectivity means, whether that's Fiber Channel, or today it's iSCSI, or direct connection. And then you have the compute, which is your storage. So it's basically the same thing. Your SQL Server binaries are on the compute, your database files are on the storage, and they're being accessed through a means to access those files, whether it's to iSCSI or Fiber Channel or any type of connection. But the concept still remains. And so when we moved into the concept of Docker and running SQL Server on containers, you still have that compute, you still have that storage where you store your SQL Server databases, and the way to access those using networking, still the same concepts remain. Same thing with Kubernetes, where you have the cluster and all, where you have the compute, storage, and networking. And the challenge that most people face is that, oh, there's going to be a new thing that I need to learn. I don't know how it works. And the challenge that most people face is that when you're learning something new, you immediately assume that it's actually a new thing, when in fact it's not. It's a new implementation of an old thing. And that's one of the reasons I tell people, look, I'm not that smart. I just go back to the things that I already know. Meaning I'm not relearning new things. I'm just relearning old things. And because of that, it makes the connection so easy, right? When I started learning Docker containers from like 4 years ago, I just made a connection between, oh, this is what it was. And it's just a new implementation. When I started learning Kubernetes 3 years ago, it's the same thing. It's just a new implementation of an old concept. And so when you're attending conferences like these, sure, it's tempting to learn as many as you can, but then there's information overload where you don't even know what to do with the information, right? You don't even know how to deal with that information. You focus. Pick 1 or 2 tracks that you want to learn, whether it's something that you already know or something that you want to learn about, right? And you also need to ask yourself the question, what do I want to be doing within the next 5 years? Do I want to be, or 2 years for that matter, because 5 years is long. You got to have a short and then a long-term goal. What do I want to be doing within the next 1 or 2 years? Do I want to be doing the same thing over and over and over again where it becomes boring? And for some people, that becomes, their source of confidence. Look, I know this. I really, really know this. And so it's easy for them to just gravitate towards learning that one thing. So for instance, if you've been doing performance tuning for a while, you would immediately gravitate to anything that's related to performance tuning. New features in SQL Server 2022 that makes performance tuning easier, new capabilities. And it's easy to gravitate towards that because now I've already done this before. I just want to know another way of doing it, right? So that's one thing. But also take into account and ask yourself the question, what do I want to do between now and the next year and the next 2 years? And treat yourself as your own business or your own company, because you need to constantly be growing. I've heard somebody once said, if you're not growing, you're technically dying, right? Because we're living organisms. And there's this myth and there's this fact where, oh, in order for me to learn more, I just need to learn more. Well, come on. We all have the smartphone right in our hands. We all have access to the internet. There's a ton of information out there, but that does not guarantee growth. Sure, it creates that impression that I've learned something. It creates that impression that I learned. But the real test of learning is putting your learning hat out there and applying what it is that you've learned, testing it out until you become so comfortable that you can now actually do what you need to do. All right. So that's where it is. That's where it's at. I'm going to head over inside and also going to prepare for my upcoming presentation. And hopefully, if PASS is going to publish that like the way they did last 2 years ago or 3 years ago when they had one of my presentations on YouTube. I hope they do that. But if not, I'll probably do that in one of these live streams in the future. With that, I am so excited. Today's the last day. I'm so excited to finally do my presentation, because throughout the week I was just volunteering and helping out. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And this is me signing off from the West Coast. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again next week.